In 1564, the word Lutheran first echoed across the humid marshes of Florida, not as a badge of faith, but as a death sentence. To the Spanish conquistadors, the term was a convenient shorthand for heresy, a generic label for anyone who dared to defy the Pope. It served as a political weapon, casting a wide net over any who challenged the centralized authority of the Roman Catholic Church. Yet, the true story of Lutheranism in America is far stranger and more resilient than a mere footnote of colonial conflict. It is a 300-year saga of a faith that arrived in fragments, survived through ecclesiastical anarchy, and was eventually forced to decide if it would remain a European relic or become a new American force. The narrative of American Lutheranism is not merely a chronicle of immigrant arrivals, but a profound study in the persistent tension between the preservation of ancient ecclesiastical heritage and the inexorable demands of a burgeoning new world. While popular historical consciousness often associates the denominational surge with the massive migrations of the 19th century, the Lutheran presence in the Western Hemisphere actually predates the established colonies of the Eastern Seaboard. This early history is characterized by a series of fragmented, often transitory settlements that functioned without institutional coherence. Yet these isolated groups remained anchored by a distinct Reformation identity that refused to be extinguished by the wilderness. The journey of the Lutheran faith in America is defined by a central purpose, that these disparate beginnings eventually necessitated a move toward structural maturity. This transformation was made possible only through the arrival of transformative leadership like that of Henry Melchior Mühlenberg. From the failed experiments in South America and the mislabeled Lutherans of Spanish Florida, the foundational era was a crucible of religious confusion. To the state-sponsored Swedish colonies on the Delaware under the pastoral care of Rioris Torquillus, the era was marked by cultural dissonance and institutional fragility. Understanding these early foundations requires an examination of how these settlers navigated a competitive religious market. They moved forward without the traditional safety nets of European state support, eventually laying the groundwork for a uniquely American expression of the Reformation. The temporal reach of Lutheran influence in the Americas extends back to the very first wave of European exploration, long before the faith achieved any semblance of institutional stability. In 1528, a group of German immigrants established a short-lived settlement in what is now modern-day Venezuela. This community holds the distinction of being the earliest documented Lutheran presence in the Western Hemisphere. However, the experiment was ultimately hindered by geographic isolation and a total lack of structural support. The settlement vanished without leaving a lasting institutional mark on South American history. Further north, the term Lutheran surfaced in Florida in 1564, though its use by Spanish Catholic authorities served as a generic label for heresy rather than a precise denominational marker. The individuals were actually French Huguenots, yet to the Spanish imagination, any break from Rome was filtered through the lens of Martin Luther's original rebellion. This conflation underscores the intense religious animosity of the period, where a simplified view of Protestantism helped Spanish officials consolidate political opposition against any non-Catholic interlopers. As the 17th century progressed, the Lutheran faith found more stable ground through the state-sponsored ventures of Sweden and Holland. In 1638, the establishment of colonies in Delaware and what would eventually become New York led to the formal founding of Lutheran churches. These congregations served as indispensable cultural and spiritual anchors for families living along the Atlantic coast, benefiting from direct support from the Church of Sweden. This arrangement afforded a degree of stability and pastoral oversight, ensuring that the Swedish presence under leaders like Rioris Torquillus possessed a formalized structure from its inception. However, this continuity faced a severe rupture in the early 19th century. Driven by a scarcity of clergy, these historic parishes were transferred to the Episcopal Church. This transition effectively terminated the independent existence of the oldest Lutheran churches. When new waves of Swedish immigrants arrived in the mid-1800s, they encountered a profound institutional gap. This disconnection forced the 19th century pioneers to develop a unique American-Swedish identity, rebuilding their synods, seminaries, and congregations from the ground up. While Scandinavian efforts were state-supported, German Lutheranism followed a different trajectory, characterized by a massive surge in emigration after 1730. Many were deeply influenced by Pietism, a spiritual movement that prioritized personal piety and emotional devotion over rigid dogmatic formulas. Settlement was heavily concentrated in the middle colonies, with Pennsylvania serving as the primary destination due to its fertile lands and relative religious tolerance. However, groups remained scattered across New York, Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas. These isolated communities often struggled to secure regular pastoral care. Throughout this period, the overarching theme was one of institutional weakness. Individual congregations functioned as independent units, resulting in what has been termed ecclesiastical anarchy. Without established synods or schools, the specific teachings of the Reformation were difficult to transmit to the next generation, threatening the long-term survival of a distinct identity. The transition to the American wilderness forced a radical rethinking. The state church models of Europe simply could not be replicated in the harsh conditions of the frontier. Leaders had to adapt to the egalitarian spirit of the colonies. Pastors were required to lead through persuasion and service rather than official mandate. Assimilation became an immediate and intense threat. Sharp cultural dissonance often compelled immigrants to abandon their native language to avoid social stigma. Many feared that failing to adapt would result in the loss of members to more American denominations with greater resources or more aggressive evangelism strategies. This created a tension between the Reformation past and the need to reach the current generation. In this environment of religious freedom, participation was entirely voluntary. By the mid-18th century, the fragmented state of German Lutheranism in the colonies had reached a critical juncture. The arrival of Henry Melchior Mühlenberg in 1742 served as the pivotal catalyst for transforming disorganized parishes into a coherent denomination. Commissioned by the Pietist centers in Germany, he was selected for his unique combination of theological rigor and organizational acumen. He stepped into an environment defined by ecclesiastical anarchy, where congregations were frequently preyed upon by unqualified preachers. Henry Melchior Mühlenberg found a landscape where internal disputes and a lack of legitimate leadership threatened the very survival of the faith. His leadership was characterized by a tireless commitment. He functioned as a peripatetic supervisor, traveling thousands of miles on horseback to remote settlements. His journey took him to the most isolated outposts, where he worked to resolve conflicts and install pastors who were actually qualified for the task. His personal mission was to bring a sense of professionalism and authority that had been sorely lacking in the colonial wilderness. Through this active oversight, he balanced the strict doctrinal requirements of his European training with the practical, often harsh realities of the American frontier. This earned him the title of the Patriarch of American Lutheranism, as he provided the unifying figurehead the scattered congregations required. He operated under the foundational motto, Ecclesia Plantanda, the church must be planted. This was not merely a romantic notion of growth, but a strategic shift from temporary survival to long-term institutional health. He realized that the faith would inevitably wither in the new world if it were not intentionally cultivated through formal structures. This vision necessitated the establishment of permanent buildings and educational programs to anchor the community. He sought a standardized way of being Lutheran in a pluralistic landscape, moving toward a collective identity. To achieve this, he spearheaded the creation of the Ministerium of Pennsylvania in 1748, the first permanent Lutheran synod in North America. This provided a vital template for all future organizational efforts, allowing pastors to gather for mutual support and theological discussion. Its primary function was the examination and ordination of candidates, protecting churches from the deception of unqualified vagabonds. By setting clear standards for conduct and education, the synod ensured that the leadership was both qualified and doctrinally sound. Furthermore, the ministerium worked toward a standardization of practice by developing a common liturgy and hymnal. Using the same resources allowed geographically distant congregations to forge a collective identity that transcended local differences. The American Revolution served as a profound test, forcing a transition from colonial dependency to national independence. Lutherans found themselves politically divided. Some remained loyal to the British crown, while many others integrated into the patriot cause. Henry Melchior Mühlenberg's own family embodied this shift. His son Peter Mühlenberg became a legendary figure of this transition. Peter Mühlenberg famously exchanged his robes for a military uniform to lead a regiment in the Continental Army. This high-profile participation helped demonstrate that Lutherans could be both faithful to their heritage and loyal citizens of the emerging republic. The conclusion of the war brought an end to European state support, forcing the Church to adopt a purely voluntary model of existence. This shift increased the responsibility of the laity in managing church property and finances, fostering a more democratic ecclesiastical culture. As the nation stabilized, a significant cultural tension emerged. The younger generation increasingly favored English over the traditional German. This language question was a struggle over the very definition of the church. Was it to remain an ethnic club or become a thoroughly American denomination? The 19th century brought a demographic shift of unprecedented scale as millions of German and Scandinavian immigrants flooded into the United States. Between 1840 and 1900, this massive migration transformed Lutheranism into one of the largest Protestant bodies in the country, moving the center of gravity toward the Midwest. As these new arrivals pushed westward, they often settled in tight-knit ethnic enclaves. These little Germanys and little Norways allowed immigrants to transition slowly into American life. In these communities, the church served as the primary social and cultural anchor. The faith was preserved through native languages and traditional customs. However, this geographic expansion also led to the creation of many new regional synods that were often isolated from one another. This isolation allowed for the development of diverse theological and cultural pockets, which would soon clash as the denomination attempted to find a unified national voice. Amidst this growth, Samuel Simon Schmucker emerged as a leading voice for adaptation. He believed that for the faith to thrive, it had to move away from outdated European formalities. Samuel Simon Schmucker advocated for a version of the faith that mirrored other American Protestant groups, emphasizing revivalism, social reform, and a simplified theology. In 1855, Samuel Simon Schmucker and his allies published the Definite Synodical Platform, a document that explicitly rejected several traditional doctrines. The platform rejected the real presence in the Eucharist to make the faith more compatible with the American religious spirit. Samuel Simon Schmucker's intention was to unify the church under an American identity, but the platform instead served as a catalyst for a deep and lasting divide. His proposal was viewed by many as a betrayal of the Reformation, triggering a massive backlash from those committed to the historic confessions. The failure of the platform ensured the church would remain anchored to its historic documents, but it left the denomination deeply fractured. While some sought adaptation, a group of Saxon immigrants in Missouri sought total preservation. Arriving in 1839, they were deeply committed to the 16th century confessions. Led by C.F.W. Walther, they established a community that prioritized doctrinal purity above all else. C.F.W. Walther's leadership was instrumental in founding the Missouri Synod in 1847, a body that emphasized strict adherence to the Book of Concord. The Missouri Synod emphasized the establishment of parochial schools to protect children from secular or liberalizing influences. C.F.W. Walther's uncompromising stance provided a powerful conservative counterweight to Samuel Simon Schmucker's liberalizing tendencies. This competition forced the broader denomination to re-examine its own theological foundations, leading to a general confessional revival across American Lutheranism. By the late 19th century, the trend toward assimilation had been largely replaced by a renewed focus on preserving a distinct confessionally grounded identity. The church emerged from this era with a clearer understanding of its unique place, but it remained a house divided. Some favored ecumenical adaptation to the American spirit, while others demanded a return to strict Reformation orthodoxy. The foundations were set, but the coming century would bring even greater challenges to the identity of the faith. The stage was now set for a new kind of struggle, one defined by world wars and a linguistic revolution. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Foundations era concluded with a church that had successfully planted its roots. The friction between ancient convictions and an untamed frontier had created a uniquely American expression of the Reformation. The path was now cleared for the massive organizational realignments that would eventually culminate in the late 20th century. The foundations of the Lutheran faith in America were laid in the friction between ancient convictions and the demands of the New World. As the mid-19th century unfolded, the Lutheran movement in America recognized that mere congregational survival was insufficient for long-term viability. This realization prompted a period of comprehensive institution building where leaders sought to construct a robust infrastructure to support the burgeoning population. The method of this development involved the creation of an extensive network of schools and theological seminaries, essential for the professionalization of the ministry. By anchoring the denomination in education, the church ensured it could produce a homegrown clergy capable of navigating American culture while remaining faithful to Reformation roots. This institutional footprint extended into the social realm. The establishment of hospitals and orphanages transformed the church into a pillar of the community. These ministries addressed the holistic needs of the immigrant population, providing a vital safety net in a society that offered few government-sponsored services. While formal leadership was largely male-dominated, the functional engine of the church's growth often resided in the tireless efforts of women's mission societies. These organized groups provided a vital avenue for women to exert influence. The success of many institutional programs was directly tied to their volunteer labor and financial contributions. Through these efforts, women pioneered benevolent work that reached across the country, shaping the compassionate character of 19th century Lutheranism. Simultaneously, the denomination fostered a sophisticated written culture. Dedicated publication houses produced thousands of periodicals to bridge geographic gaps between settlers. These materials created a virtual community before the age of digital communication, providing the necessary framework for a unified theological discourse. By distributing the same hymnals and catechisms, publishing houses ensured that immigrants in the backwoods stayed spiritually linked to the centers of the faith. As resources were taxed, a missionary vision looked inward. Domestically, the impulse sought to reach marginalized groups, including African Americans and Native Americans. These efforts, though small, represented a strategic attempt to expand the Lutheran presence into the diverse landscapes of the American frontier. On the international stage, American Lutherans began to see themselves as partners in a global movement, sending ordained missionaries to Asia, Africa, and South America. This global outreach changed the church's self-perception. It was no longer just a struggling immigrant mission, but a sender of truth to the nations. As the dust settled on the frontier, the horse and buggy gave way to the engine of a new century, signaling that the era of isolated outposts was over. The foundations were now set in stone, but the voice of the church was about to grow louder and more integrated into the global conversation than ever before. The legacy of the patriarchs passed to a new generation of leaders who viewed the entire world, not just the American frontier, as their mission field. The ethnic hedges had been cleared. Lutheranism was no longer a collection of immigrant fragments, but a singular American force preparing for the trials of a global age. The foundations were deep, the roots were strong, and the stage was set. This is the end of the beginning and the start of the modernization. Join us tomorrow for part 2, where we explore the church's transition into the 20th century and its evolution into a global religious force.